the Catawba River. Indigenous natives lived on her shores. The Catawbans, meaning people of the river. And to them the river held vast spiritual powers. And even more so, it possessed a soul. It was alive. It had spirit. It was their watcher and their keeper. For enraged, she may cast forth violent floods, or soothed, her waters may recede to accompany the sounds of a placid spring day. But to the wise amongst them, she was always watching. If only she could speak, we would know her temper, her contentment, her knowledge, her thoughts. Her cool waters fed their crops. Summer days splashing carelessly on her banks. Upon her highways they traveled far, yet no word was ever spoken by her. Not a sound uttered from her lips, but she was there. On that fateful morning, a silent witness, if you will. Her mysteries as deep as the one before us. Like lowly men to a mighty God, what would we ask her if only we could? If only we could. She may respond in only whispers, too soft for man or woman to hear, or speak in languages understood only by the heavens. We begin where we left off. Strangers traversing this celestial globe, we look down now as she flows on by. You remember the story, don't you? She was found lying here, and we're here. We are but mortal souls, so let's not pretend to be divine. We who search for truth, much like the blind, only feeling the sun, never to gaze into her eyes. and for those who cast dark shadows, shredding pages left behind. Their cold sweat screams, what will they find? Cursing dusk to dawn, holding on, dear life of mine. Her noble shores, her mockingbirds and whippoorwills, her red-tailed hawks and blue spring skies, hang in place here still as the only witnesses left to testify.
Thank you.
It was Dennis and Brenda, remember? Jet skiers, out for a relaxing, fun day on the water. They launched their jet skis off of a local boat dock and headed north upriver. They soon crossed under the I-85 bridge and continued upriver from there. A little further up, they looked to their left and noticed a car had traveled down an embankment. It had come to rest on the banks of the Catawba River. Initially, they skied right past it, but later decided to circle back to check things out. Maybe somebody needed some help. It was Dennis who approached the bank first. He inched closer to the shore, and as he approached the car, there was something next to it. Closer and closer he got. Soon he realized he was looking at a body lying there. He kept screaming, "Hey, you need any help?" There was no response. Neither he nor Brenda carry cell phones on the water, so he called back to Brenda. "Brenda, call 911, there's a body lying here." Brenda, terrified, took off back downstream from where they'd come to go call 911. Dennis headed up the river in the opposite direction where there were construction workers. He yelled for them to call 911. And it was those construction workers that reached 911 operators first at 1:07 p.m. in the afternoon. Brenda's call came in 2 minutes later. "Remember that call? I'm a boater on the Catawba River," she said. "Above the I-85 bridge, there's a car that's come down the embankment, and there's a body laying there. I don't know if they're alive or not." And the scene. Ira's vehicle had come hurtling down the pathway towards the river, and would have continued on into the river, except that, right before it got to the river, the front end of the vehicle collided into a stump. Now, it wasn't a tree stump, it was more like a thick bush with a deep root system embedded into the shore. If you were standing right next to this bush, you'd probably never imagine that the embedded root system could actually stop a car. Think about it. That bush being there in that pathway of the car could be the single most important aspect of this entire story. Because if someone was trying to push that car into the river to completely hide their crime, how might that have changed the following day's headlines? They might have been, "Vibrant college co-ed comes up missing under mysterious circumstances." Or, they certainly would not have read, "College co-ed drives car down an embankment and drowns with 3 ligatures wrapped around her neck." And they certainly wouldn't have been, "The perfect crime has just been committed," especially if it had. That relatively small single bush may well have had a profound and dramatic impact on this entire mystery. What a twist of fate. Now back to the crime scene on the riverbank. Ira's body lay strangely positioned next to her car, with those ligatures wrapped around her neck. After studying the scene, Chief Belk of the Mount Holly Police Department acknowledged that Mount Holly was indeed a small town with limited resources, and it placed a call to the State Bureau for assistance in the investigation. At that time, though, he did indicate he was certain of some very important facts. First of all, Ira's car was equipped with a black box, able to record some real-time information about the car. He stated that the data from the black box indicated that when the car hit the stump, the driver's seatbelt was engaged, and that somebody was in the driver's seat. Who could that have been? He noted that the keys had been tossed just a little ways up from the car and were lying on the hill just behind it. The chief was also sure that the car was running or was under power when it was stuck there on the riverbank, because he could see the mud patterns on the front of the car. The front wheels had been spinning in place both forwards and backwards, as if someone was in the car trying to put the car in reverse or drive it forward in an attempt to dislodge it from being stuck on the stump. At the same time, he freely admitted he was not sure if the car was actually driven down the hill under power, nor could he confirm whether or not Ira was pulled out of the car on the riverbank and laid where she was ultimately found lying. His most important conclusion, though, was that he was sure that, quote, someone did that to her. When asked to clarify that statement, he emphasized someone caused her death. It was lead investigator Detective Terry with the Mount Holly Police Department who informed the public that of the 3 ligatures wrapped around Ira's neck, one of them was a blue ribbon material. You see, Detective Terry found a small women's handbag in the back seat of the car, and the bag itself was made of a colorful, flowery print material. And the straps on the handbag were actually made of this blue ribbon material. Someone, apparently, had torn off one of these ribbon handles and had tied it around Ira's neck. But it was what was inside the handbag that was peculiar. It contained a set of hand tools, pliers, and a couple screwdrivers. Now, upon reviewing these images of this handbag and its contents, Dr. Maurice Godwin, the renowned forensic psychologist assisting us in this podcast, asked, "Was that her handbag?" See the pictures of this handbag online as well as its contents by clicking on the links in this podcast description, or check out the website abodylyingthere.com. If you know whether or not this bag was indeed Ira's, that could be a critical clue in cracking this case. Please contact Fedora Media. Our email, producers@fedora.company or 323-212-5425. We need your help, and you can remain anonymous. Detective Terry also revealed that one of the ligatures was knotted so tightly around Ira's neck that the knot itself left imprints in her neck, even cutting through the skin. Remember, in these initial episodes, we were introduced to the 2 fishermen, cousins Mark and Neil, who were just downstream from where Ira's car was found. Detective Terry explained how they first became suspects. Do you remember? Well, when they were initially interviewed by detectives, they gave contradictory accounts of their movements that morning. Mark said Neil rode with him down there. Neil said he drove down there himself. Mark said Neil stayed the whole time, and Neil said he left shortly after arriving. And then, weeks later, when questioned again, their stories in an uncanny way matched exactly. And this is all in the police files. In episode 3, we heard from local newscaster Ken Lemon with Channel 9 Eyewitness News, who's been following this story since day one firsthand. Mr. Lemon described the events as they were unfolding that day from the point of view of an experienced local investigative newscaster. Remember his account? The case was like a 1,000-piece puzzle. There were never enough sufficient facts to put all the pieces together. You'd answer a few questions only to be confronted by a half-dozen more. And he emphasized the remoteness of the location where Ira's body was found. He also described for us the reaction that this case had on the locals of Mount Holly. They were shaken to the core that this sort of thing could happen there. Finally, he described how the story uncharacteristically expanded in terms of geographical interest. The surrounding communities wanted to follow it as well. Eventually, there was national interest, and it was featured on mainstream primetime programs like Dateline in 2020. In episode 4, we went back into a time machine of sorts and listened to local news reports as they were coming out at the time of Ira's murder, and found that among the news outlets reporting on the case, there was a discrepancy in terms of the timeline of where Ira was or went that morning. Everybody agreed that she was first seen on campus and next stopped at the bank. But from there, half the news reports had her going from the bank to the Goodwill and then to Jackson's Java, whereas the other half of the news reports had her going from the bank to Jackson's Java and then finally to the Goodwill. So her timeline was somewhat muddled based upon the information that was coming out in real time. We know that the timeline of a murder victim's last steps is critically important. And we also learned that Dennis and Brenda, the jet skiers that found Ira's body, had placed a cross on the river where she was found, marking the spot permanently. There are graphics showing the university area, identifying where the campus is, where the bank is, and where both Jackson's Java and the Goodwill are located. Click on the link in the podcast or visit the website www.abodylyingthere.com. Episode 5 begins by reviewing the geography of this story, especially the areas of the crime scene, or rather, where Ira was found. Her car and body were discovered on the banks of the Catawba River in the area behind the YMCA, which is in Mount Holly, all the way across town from where the campus is located. Her car was captured on video driving into and then later out of the YMCA parking lot, and was then seen traveling on the road to the subdivision, as this road was connected to the YMCA parking lot. We know that at that time the subdivision was under construction. We then used Google Earth to hover over the YMCA parking lot so that we could see where the YMCA was, where the subdivision was situated. And we also noticed that between the YMCA and subdivision properties there was a path, like a pathway that had been mowed, that went all the way down between the two properties. And we learned that this pathway was actually a utility right-of-way, where underneath it there were power lines. Utility companies would mow a pathway through the brush and so that they could come onto the property and maintain their power lines. Now, this main utility right-of-way between the two properties didn't go all the way down to the river. Instead, before reaching the river, it branched off into 3 separate pathways, each of which was its own separate right-of-way. It was those 3 paths that actually continued all the way down to the river. The right-of-ways become important for a couple of reasons. We want to know the exact route Ira's car traveled all the way down to the river. Now, the only way to get all the way down to the river is by ultimately traveling down one of these 3 lower right-of-ways. We know a victim's final steps, or in this case, the final route her car traveled, is always important. Also, if we know the route her car traveled all the way to the river, we ultimately will precisely know where her car came to rest. Also, by studying the 3 right-of-ways on the maps, we found a strange square formation in between them where there was no vegetation at all. And it was a square pattern. It looked like where a building had once sat. There may have been a building there at that time, and it's possible Ira's car could have traveled right past it on its way down to the river. If that's the case, we want to know, what kind of building was it, if it was indeed a building. You may click on the link in the podcast description entitled Maps, or visit the website abodylyingthere.com to see a graphic showing all of these geographical features by the river. The YMCA, the subdivision, the mostly dirt road going through the subdivision that, from what it looks like, Ira's car would have traveled down coming out of the YMCA parking lot, since they're connected. Also, you can see the utility right-of-ways themselves that lie between the 2 properties. Remember, Fedora decided to come to Charlotte because we wanted to see the geography for ourselves, as there were several inconsistencies being reported in terms of what was the exact route Ira's car took down to the river, where exactly did her car ultimately wind up, and we wanted to determine exactly where the fishermen were in relation to where Ira was found to determine the exact distance between the two spots. So it was not only these geographical inconsistencies that brought Fedora to Charlotte. It was, again, the inconsistencies mentioned in episode 4. The reporting of Ira's timeline and movements up by the campus that morning. We wanted to see if we could glean for ourselves insights into her timeline up by the campus by performing our own time tests of the travel paths she may have purportedly taken. Finally, we came to Charlotte to experience all of the intangibles of being on the scene, near the crime scene, studying the area for ourselves, getting to know the area and its community, the lay of the land, if you will. These are all important intangibles that are best experienced in order to possibly and ultimately determine and understand what happened. Season 2 started with episode 6, where we were introduced in a more in-depth way to the people involved in this story, from the detectives to the reporters to the fishermen and their friends and families, and reviewed the thoughts of prosecutors and defense counsels, as well as the attorneys from the North Carolina Center for Actual Innocence. All of these people are good people, but by necessity they are in adversarial positions. One thing I can say for sure, they are all seeking justice, that elusive construct never adequately defined to which we are all bound from conception by design. Episode 7, we heard from Stuart Watson, who shared his investigative secrets, his sources and methods as an investigative reporter, having served a distinguished 16-year career here at NBC affiliate WCNC Charlotte. He is affectionately referred to by Fedora staff, of course, as Dr. Watson. His words still echo in my mind. Attention to detail is everything. We've got to start without a theory. How do we know what we know? Does that fit, or does that not fit at all? Look with eyes wide open. If I start with a conclusion during an investigation, that might skew what I find. If we start with the conclusion that the fishermen are guilty, that might prejudice what I might factually conclude. Likewise, if I start with the conclusion that the fishermen are innocent, I might also factually prejudice what I might conclude. In episode 8, we began by actually tracing Ira's steps that morning ourselves, having arrived on scene here in Charlotte. She was seen on campus that morning and next seen at the bank. All accounts are in agreement on that point. We started by time testing the travel path from the bank to the Goodwill. The first time it timed out at 8 minutes. We also noticed that Jackson's Java was pretty close to the bank. It was all the way on the other side of the street. We next then timed the travel path coming back down University Boulevard from the Goodwill. From the Goodwill to Jackson's Java, it took us 11 minutes. Some have put forth the theory that Ira did this to herself, that she committed suicide. We heard from nationally renowned forensic psychologist Dr. Maurice Godwin, who had reviewed the preliminary information provided to him on this case, and he thought that the idea that Ira committed suicide was absurd, stating that who commits suicide with the car and then steps back 3 or 4 feet and lies down? Episode 9, WSOC's Ken Lemon again, delineating the irrefutable facts, remember? Quote, Ira Yarmolenko on the banks of the Catawba River. She is dead from asphyxiation. She's murdered. She's murdered with items she brought there with her. Those are the facts. Unquote. We also have the undisputed fact that she was first seen on campus that morning prior to being seen at the bank. So we continued along Ira's footsteps, We are now at Jackson's Java, and the news reports indicated that Ira was last spotted at Jackson's Java at 10:50. So we time tested the travel path from Jackson's Java to the YMCA parking lot all the way across town and arrived at the YMCA at 11:16 a.m. There is a video of this entire trip on the website online. We also carefully reviewed the video of Ira dropping off clothes at the Goodwill that morning. It was a process that she was familiar with. She had bags that were empty and bags that were full. She knew that all the empty bags would be going into one receptacle at the drop-off location, and that all of the other bags that were full would be placed somewhere else. So she methodically handed the bags to the attendant in that order. She finally handed what looked like boogie boards to the attendant, but they had handles on them, so they weren't exactly boogie boards. They appear to have been lifeguard boards with handles on them. Which begs the question, did Ira actually work at the YMCA at some point as a lifeguard, as was rumored? Does anybody know the answer to this question? This, remember, is an investigation in real time. Contact Fedora producers at fedora.company or 323-212-5425. You can remain anonymous. Also, at the Goodwill, there is a peculiar item handed to the attendant that looked like it had a significant amount of color to it. Did you catch that? Have we seen that before? In episode 10, having just arrived at the YMCA parking lot from Jackson's Java, in episode 9, we ventured one step further, driving into the adjacent subdivision. And we took the same road that Ira's car traveled heading into that subdivision, aka Parkview Drive, in order to experience the area where Ira's car would have had to have passed before ultimately plunging towards the river. And since we were at that point in Gaston County, we headed over to the courthouse to obtain timestamps on some important images that were in the case files. Those timestamps were as follows. We had images of Ira at the bank. The earliest timestamp on those was 10:18 a.m. in the morning, and the last one was at 10:20 and 55 seconds, so roughly 10:21, where she was still at the counter conducting her business. So if she's at the counter at 10:21, we know that she was probably at the bank or the bank parking lot at least a couple minutes after that. And we also got images of Ira driving into and then later out of the YMCA parking lot. And the timestamps on her driving into the YMCA parking lot was 11:09, and the timestamp on the images of her coming out heading towards the subdivision was 11:10. So it appears that she just simply drove right into the parking lot and drove right back out. And I say her driving, we don't know precisely or exactly if that was her driving. We're just making that assumption at this point. But having those precise times is extremely important in attempting to put all the pieces together in determining Ira's final steps that morning. Episode 11. After having obtained what we wanted from the courthouse, we headed back to the campus area. This time to take a second reading going from the bank to the Goodwill, so that we could have another reading to average out our times. You'll recall, the first time we went from the bank to the Goodwill, it took 8 minutes. This time it took 7 minutes, so we can average those two. We also wanted to time test the travel path, assuming this time Ira's last stop was the Goodwill, meaning she would have gone from the bank, then to Jackson's Java to drop off gifts, and then finally to the Goodwill to drop off clothing, before next being seen at the YMCA parking lot all the way across town. The time it took to travel from the Goodwill to the YMCA parking lot was 25 minutes. Also, while we were in the campus area, we stopped at the SECU credit union, the Kannapolis branch, and talked to Jane Fisher, who testified in the Mark Carver trial, to see if we could get information from her concerning what Ira's last banking transaction was that morning. She asked me to email her and she would forward my request to the higher-ups in Raleigh, and we haven't heard back from them. We also talked to unnamed individuals close to Jackson's Java, you'll remember, who indicated that Ira simply dropped off a couple items that morning. She was there for only a couple minutes and then she was gone. They indicated she just finished a test and was heading back to Chapel Hill, things that we know, but she was only there for a couple of minutes, and that's important in putting the pieces together in her timeline. As an update to the Mark Carver case, the fisherman who was convicted of Ira's murder, we know that he spent several years in prison. Eventually, he was granted a new trial, in large part because it was pointed out that the lab procedures used to determine that it was Mark Carver's DNA that was found on Ira's car were not the most up-to-date procedures. And because most of the DNA material was consumed in the initial testing, the DA felt he had no recourse from there but to drop the charges on Mark Carver, who is now a free man. For this real-time podcast investigation, we pick up where we left off. It's been a busy day, hasn't it? Traveling from the bank to the Goodwill, then to Jackson's Java, and then finally to the river. Then retracing our steps from the campus area again, but the second time, assuming her last stop was the Goodwill, time testing the travel path to the river that way. We did all this in one day, on the day of May 5, the same date that Ira was found, just so we could assimilate her movements as closely as possible. It just so happens that tonight's a full moon, and before it's over, we wanted to answer some important questions. When you are looking at this case from 1,000 feet in the air, from a bird's eye view, we've been focused on two main areas of interest. The campus area, where she was seen going between the bank, the Goodwill, and Jackson's Java, and the river area, where she was found lying on the riverbanks. In terms of the campus area, we wanted to know the order of stops that she made that morning, as we're following her timeline. And conceptually, that starts out fairly simple. But there are conflicting reports. And if you don't have the important locations embedded in your mind, then tracing her steps is more difficult. Where are these locations situated in relation to each other? The campus area, the bank, the Goodwill, Jackson's Java, the road that she would have traveled on to get between these locations? Where are the freeways that she would have taken from the campus area to eventually get to the river area? And how did she enter onto these freeways? And then from the river area, it starts out rather simply as well. She was seen pulling into and then out of the YMCA parking lot, then heading down through the subdivision towards the river on the only road that is connected to the parking lot, Parkview Drive, which heads down through the adjacent subdivision. But since that road itself does not travel all the way down to the river, that raises a whole new set of questions, doesn't it? You have to be able to look at the river area, both on a map as well as on the ground, in order to identify the important locations and geographic features. And since this area around the river was under construction in 2008 and still is today, and because there are so many geographical features converging in one spot, it's not easy to be able to now or even then to identify the important features, both on a map and on the ground. What was her car's complete travel path towards the river? Where exactly on the river was she found? What path did the fishermen take to get to the river, and where were the fishermen's fishing spot? What was the precise distance between where Ira was found and where the fishermen's fishing spot was? We also determined that Ira would have eventually had to travel down one of the utility right-of-ways that were in between the YMCA and the adjacent subdivision properties. So what do the right-of-ways look like? How are they situated, and which one did she go down? Also, there was a strange square formation that was between the right-of-ways that went down to the river, so we wanted to know, what was it? Did Ira's car go past it? Click on the Maps link in the podcast description or go to the Maps page on the website to review detailed visuals of both the campus area as well as the river area. You will find these visuals helpful. There's other questions we want to answer too, some of which you, the audience, may be able to help with. The handbag that was found in the back of Ira's car, was that hers? Remember those strange tools that were inside it? Click on the handbag link in the podcast description or visit that page on the website to see pictures of the handbag as well as its contents. Also, from the detective's files, we have obtained the entire video of Ira dropping off items at the Goodwill that morning. She was handing items to the attendant at the Goodwill that morning. Was there something in those items that looks familiar? She also handed what looked like kickboards or lifeguard boards to the Goodwill employee. Did Ira work as a lifeguard at the YMCA at one time? Or is there confirmation that her ex-boyfriend Jeremy worked there? Also, Dr. Godwin noticed something strange about her movements as she was dropping off items at the Goodwill that seemed peculiar. We'll hear from him later on that, but did you catch anything that looked peculiar in her movements? Click on the clues link in the podcast to see that video or visit that section on the website. Also on the website, you'll find a video of the first leg of the trip that we took going from the bank to the Goodwill to Jackson's Java and then finally all the way across town to the YMCA. Click on the river description in the podcast or see that section on the website. So we've uncovered some important facts in this case which will soon be revealed. But we need your help on filling in some blank spots, if you will. Ira was seen on campus that morning. If you spoke to Ira that morning, we'd like to hear from you. Producers at fedora.company or 323-212-5425. Also, Ira's body was found on May 5, but the previous Friday, May 2nd, was her birthday. If you spent any time with Ira or talked to her between May 2nd and May 5 during her birthday weekend, we'd like to hear from you as well. Also, Ira was found wearing UNC Pembroke University sweatshirt, which seems odd since she was attending UNC Charlotte and was soon going to be transferring to UNC Chapel Hill. So why the UNC Pembroke sweatshirt? Was it hers? Someone she knew? The mystery continues.